Hi everyone, this is Ricky Spencer and welcome to another of our series for the sociology of media and teaching in Australia. Today we are going to have a really deep dive conversation about one of the areas that I have been talking about for many years, and I'm so excited this is finally happening in NAM in Australia. Professor Camilleri is one of Australia's leading international relations scholars. With over 30 years' experience, Professor Camilleri has pursued a wide range of research interests covering almost the entire gamut of the international relations discipline. These include regional and global governance, the political economy of Asia Pacific, the role of religion and culture in international affairs, the politics of oil and the Middle East, and security policy, including weapons non-proliferation. He has supervised more than 30 PhD and MA candidates, published over 15 books, several of which have been translated into, wow, how about this, everyone? Arabic, Japanese, and Mandarin. He has produced over 20 chapters in books since 1993 and has over 20 refereed articles published in academic journals. Without further ado, welcome Professor Camilleri to our web podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Lovely. So let's get right down to it. This series, introduction to this series, what inspired you to create this series on ethics in turbulent times?
Well, we're doing it, as you know, through the auspices of an initiative that's now in its fourth year called Conversation at the Crossroads. And we established Conversation at the Crossroads precisely because we felt that the quality of the public conversation needed a fair bit of raising. The quality is nowhere near what it ought to be and what it can be. And so we've been busy for the last 4 years putting on many events, including an earlier series a couple of years ago. But in the course of all these conversations, it became clear that's what's missing in the conversation and in a lot of people's minds is, do we have a compass for knowing how to react to the complex challenges we face today, whether they are the likes of mental health, disability, homelessness, in a context of what happens within the country, and of course the bigger issues that are also affecting us at least as much, including the likes of climate change and the extraordinary rise of violence that we've seen on the world stage, particularly of the last 10 or so years, contrary to what we had hoped would be the case at the end of the Cold War, well over 30 years ago now. So the issue is, how do we move forward? How do we approach very complex issues? Is there anything that approaches a compass that can give us a sense of direction? How do we distinguish right from wrong? So that's an attempt over the course of 6 weeks, and we've only got 3 hours each Tuesday evening, beginning the 10th, to try and begin to explore some of these questions. We used to have, in days gone by, with those who were of religious, let's say, inclination, had a faith of some kind, that provided something like a compass, a direction, for better or for worse. Whereas today, where religion is on the way out, except for some pockets, it hasn't been replaced by something that gives people a sense of confidence in tackling, in responding to the challenges we are facing. So that's a need. This is only going to be a drop in the bucket, but it's good to have a few drops at least, and the bucket can get fuller as time goes on.
Mm. And following on from that, how would you define turbulent times? And why is it important to address ethics during such periods?
Well, there's a big question for you. Let me have a go. First of all, the turbulence. Well, if we just think back for a moment as to what's been happening for the last 20 or 30 years, and it's building up to a kind of climax, dramatic change in our world. And we're experiencing it everywhere, Australia included, of course. Dramatic change. To the point that people now speak of existential threats. Particularly, they have in mind two. The usual suspects are climate change and what might happen over the next 20 or 30 years. Not very pleasant to contemplate, but we have to. And the other one, the possibility of a nuclear war, which we thought had greatly receded with the end of the Cold War, but unfortunately, because of tensions and conflict, the possibility has once again come to the forefront. Okay, but in addition to those, we know there are many other things. We've just seen it through the COVID pandemic, what can happen within countries and globally very, very quickly, and how ill-prepared the world was. At the latest figure I saw was that close to 7 million people died as a result of the pandemic in different parts of the world. And by and large, governments were caught flat-footed. And I'm not so sure that they would be much better placed come another pandemic. And many experts are telling us it's on the cards within the next 5 to 10 years. And there are so many others. But so what I'm trying to get at is we are reaching a threshold which may be as critical in human history as any we've seen over the last 200,000 years. And the issue is, are we able to rise to the challenge posed by these multiple threats, not just to human life, but to the planet, to other species that we know, loss of biodiversity and everything else. So there's the turbulence. We live in uncertain times. We know there are huge challenges. We're not sure, and I haven't mentioned one other, the question of new emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and so much else, and where that will land us. So these are turbulent times. It's as if we're going on a plane, on a flight, and it is unbelievable turbulence, and we're not sure how it is to be handled. So that is the context. And the question of ethics is there a way of saying, once we've looked at the complexity of all that's happening, is there a way of saying, this is how we should approach some of these issues? This is how to respond to the uncertainty and the threats we are facing at this time. These are some of the do's and don'ts we should keep in mind personally, professionally, as citizens of a country or the world. So there it is, in a nutshell, anyhow.
So now that you've really whet our appetites for this incredible series, let's talk a bit about the session content and structure. Can you provide an overview of the topics briefly covered in each of the 6 sessions?
Yes, well, we will start first of all with a general introduction to what we mean by ethics. Some people call it morality. And it's often been said that the fundamental aspect of that remains what many of the world's ethical systems, some of them with a religious flavor in the past, have come up with, which is the golden rule. Well, we're going to explore that. That is to say, the idea that you should treat others the way you would like them to treat you. Well, that's interesting. That may have something to be said for it, but there are issues, complexities. It's not a panacea for dealing with the difficult challenges we face. So we're going to look at ethics how we approach appropriate responses and behavior in the world in which we live, in our situation. And this, of course, because it is international in some way, we look at Australia, but we also look at other places. And we'll have Peter Singer with us, who, of course, is one of the leading ethicists of the last 20 years, who's written about many, many things, many books. And in his case, of course, a very influential figure. Some say he's one of the 3 leading ethicists in today's world, from how we should treat human beings, how we should treat animals, how we should treat the planet. And he will share some of those insights with us, opening up some of the big ethical questions we need to face. So that'll be at the beginning. And then we will go on to the big one, which is climate change and what challenges that poses, but not just challenges in the sense of, let's say, extreme weather events, right? The challenge is not that, really. The challenge is, what is our responsibility? That's really the key idea of ethics. When you're facing a crisis, a challenge, a threat, whose responsibility is it to do something about it? And as individuals, as members of a profession, as those who run a business, those who teach, parents, teachers, leaders of countries, the international community as a whole. So climate change poses those questions. How should we, it's not, a lot of people, just briefly, a lot of people think of climate change, we need alternative sources of technology, right? Alternative sources of energy, so that we can keep living exactly as we have been and are doing right now. But is that so? Or might we need to consider a change of lifestyles? Might we need to consider different patterns of consumption, as well as different ways of producing energy, less carbon emitting sources of energy? So it's complex. So we'll raise all these questions. And central to that is the question of democracy. Who makes the decisions? Who has responsibility? Who should expect to exercise responsibility and have a say in the decisions that are made? And so we will try and tie those two together. And then we're going to talk about some of these new technologies, how we should treat them. It raises the very crucial question of consciousness, the human agency. What role for human intelligence, human consciousness, and if there is to be a thing called artificial intelligence, or different ways of tinkering with the species in a biological sense. What does that do to agency? What does that do to understanding? What does that do to responsibility and how it is to be exercised? Very complex questions. And we will be trying and at least get a sense of what are some of the deep questions we need to handle. And then we know that at the moment the world is organized in states. Countries have states. And the question is, what happens when those who are in charge of states commit serious crimes? If the state is sovereign and no one else may interfere in the affairs of a state, but a state behaves very badly, either with its own people inside the country, inside its borders, or by what it does across other countries, who then can somehow deal with a criminal when the criminal is the state authority? And this is rife. We're seeing it on the part of those that are waging wars, often war crimes, sometimes genocide. All right. Who comes in and fixes that problem, or could, or should. And but there is more to it than just use of violence, which the state has. It has a monopoly on the means of violence, or a near monopoly. But what about mass corruption? When a state is corrupt, top to bottom, what happens? Who can step in and deal with that criminal activity? Now, these are very much unresolved questions which need to be discussed. And then we need to pose the question, culture, there are profound differences in the world, within countries and between. Sometimes it has a religious flavor to it, Jewish, Muslim, Muslim, Christian, whatever it may be, but it can be cultural, it can be ethnic. Deep tensions we've seen as a result of the war in Gaza, tensions occurring within countries, including Australia. How does one handle? How do you replace conflict with dialogue? Can you? And if so, how and whose responsibility is to move in this direction? And finally, we come, I think, to the very important one for Australia, the question of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia. And we ask, I think, the deeper question, which the referendum, the voice to Parliament referendum, the debacle, really, it was a debacle, failed to even raise. Because a lot of people say, rightly, that there are a lot of injustices that the Indigenous peoples have experienced since European invasion. And these have to be righted, absolutely. But in a sense, you know, there is a deeper question. It's not just remedying the injustices, which needs to be done, but it's whether non-Indigenous Australians are prepared to accept that there is a thing called Indigenous wisdom, which we desperately need to attend to some of these major challenges we've been speaking about, to concede that, to respect that, and to recognize that. That is the recognition, the deeper recognition. How can Indigenous wisdom be incorporated in the overall wisdom at our disposal in order to face up to some of these daunting challenges that we face in today's world? So that's it. With so many other issues we could have handled, we had to make some choices, but we're only using them as illustrations of how we might go about handling these very complex questions.
And that sort of kind of answered my next question, which is challenges and ethical decision making. But I want to probably add one thing to that and ask you, and in terms for the audience listening and those who will attend, to start perhaps thinking as they're attending these sessions, how can individuals navigate conflicting ethical values in challenging situations?
Well, yes, that's at the moment, if you think of average household, and let's think Australia, you know, what are the deepest influences impacting on a young person, a child gradually moving to adolescence, and then young adult? And these are the formative years. Well, there are many influences, of course, but three stand out. There's the home, parenting, mentoring, guardianship of adults in relation to younger people. And that usually happens in a household, occasionally in communities. But the same question, how is that to be done? Using the simple word for the moment, parenting, how do we parent in ways that equip a younger generation to be able to handle these challenges we're facing. So there's one big influence. The second one is education. We still accept the view that children and then younger people ought to receive an education. Preschool, primary, secondary, and then higher education of one kind or another. Well, the question is posed, is our educational system or systems fit for purpose? Do they equip an emerging new generation to handle these enormous challenges we are facing? Because that, at the end of the day, is the test. It's not whether it gets you a job, valuable though it is to have a constructive job once one has gone through the educational system. Yes, but the bigger question is, does it equip you to know what to do, how to respond, how to exercise responsibility? What are the options? And the third is the media. Both traditional media and mainstream media and now what we call social media. And these are very big, complex areas, each of which, in my view at least, is failing at the moment to live up to its responsibilities. And so we have to have a conversation about what can be done and what can be done better than is presently the case, because that will largely help to shape the capacity, the skill, the willingness, the enthusiasm of an emerging generation to handle some of these momentous situations, circumstances that we now have to deal with.
Mm. And now that leads beautifully onto our next question, which is the role of leadership and responsibility. And interesting, I'm going to preface that by saying responsibilities. What role do leaders play in promoting ethical behavior during crises?
Well, in theory, a very important role. In practice, if we're looking at, not theoretically, but if we're looking at how things panning out, there is a lack of leadership, effective, responsible leadership, ethically driven leadership. Well, I can only illustrate it. Let's take political leadership. Let's face it, the structures, of course, there are always notable exceptions, individuals that rise above the pressures and exercise responsible leadership. But that is the exception. By and large, the structures, the political structures, the party structures, the parliamentary structure, the bureaucratic structures are not well equipped to integrate ethical responses to the way they go about their work. So even at the height of, let's say, the pandemic, we saw so much happening, going on, which was really geared, how do I gain an advantage or prevent the opponent from getting an advantage in relation to this question? Playing, if you like, wedge politics. And that happens all the time. That's one thing. And the second thing is the powerful pressures. So in a sense, those who are in principle in positions of authority and leadership are often pawns or allow themselves to become pawns because they see power in a particular area and they dare not take that power on should they regard it as colliding with an ethical or principled position. And so they give in, the line of least resistance. So if a particular government believes that to act in a certain way, even though it may be ethical, would provoke the ire of powerful interests, be they economic or media interests or whatever, they might take the line of least resistance and then rationalize doing something other than the ethical thing, even if often they invoke ethical principles to defend that which is unethical. So we live in complex, and in days gone by, for better or for worse, people thought of religious leaders as having authority when it came to ethical questions. Well, religion, as I mentioned before, is a shadow of what it was in terms of authority. And I regret to say that many, at least of the main established religions in this country, which is various shades of grey, are into survival mode and really very insular. Now, they're not really alive to the big issues that we're discussing. They're more concerned about surviving, the bureaucratic organizational demands of survival, and that's where the minds are. And they're not, unfortunately, with their own religious traditions should telling them to be. So that's something else we need to. So many of our institutions, for one reason, that includes media institutions, are just not able at this point to exercise effective, ethically driven leadership, which is in part why the situation on so many fronts is getting worse rather than better. It's if there is a silver lining, and there is, it comes not from established organizations, those holding, quote, authoritative positions. It is coming from the social movements. All the important social movements of the last 40, 50 and more years, gender-based, those concerned with disability, with homelessness, with a range of gender-related issues, those concerned with issues of peace and war, social justice, etc. It is there that we can see, I think, true exercise of responsibility, and but often from relatively scarce, having at their disposal scarce resources with which to do it. But nevertheless, a responsibility is being exercised by a number of people in many places, many parts of the world. There is hope, there is encouragement, but there's a lot to build upon.
And as we're wrapping up, I want to now ask you about participant engagement. How do you encourage discussion and engagement among participants during these sessions?
Well, of course, there is input. There is input by those making presentations, not very long, I should say, presentations, but because you need information. But of course, the key, and this is what I often say, the test of a good presentation, which then allows for questions and slowing down and people saying, I don't understand what you're getting at, or I don't argue, I don't agree with what you're saying, is that when you go out of that door, eventually, you have enough, you've gained enough from that presentation to be able to make it a subject of conversation with people in your network. In a presentation that leaves you no better equipped to hold a conversation leaves much to be desired. But all right, presentation there has to be, but we have conversation actually in small groups. That's very important. It's very important because it gives people an opportunity to participate, but more importantly, it's a dress rehearsal for the kinds of conversations that can then continue outside of that session, of the 3-hour session, in the home, at work, in the office, the factory, wherever you are, the leisure space, wherever you happen to be. So, and then there are skilling sessions where we discuss techniques for encouraging conversation, for conducting conversation, for engaging in conversation. And that means listening skills, more important perhaps even than speaking skills. That's the key to conversation, to make the other person understand that you're really interested in what they have to say, that you're really there not so much to tell them, to show them how intelligent or informed you are, but that you're really genuinely interested in knowing what they think, what they feel. And as Peter Singer, I'm sure, has said and will say probably, it's reason, very important, has to be reason, but has to be also emotion. People have feelings. They're not just minds at work. They have feelings, and the feelings and the minds must somehow come together constructively in the conversation. So we try and find little ways of encouraging that, even some role play. Time is short, but a bit of role play as well.
And I'm just looking, so this, now, will this be something that people can go online? Will this be like, or is this going to be in actual physical space that people...
It's a physical space. It'll be at University College, which is part of University of Melbourne. But it'll be online, available to anyone who's interested, may not be able to physically get to the place, or if they're in another state or another country, that's all possible. So we do encourage online participation. On the other hand, it's true to say that there is a buzz occurring in the space, the physical space. So those who live in Melbourne and not too far away from the location should make every effort to be there, because there are opportunities for conversation and networking outside of the formal sessions during that space. We have time before we get started, cups of tea. There is catering, very nice food and refreshments available in the break in the middle and at the end. So that's opportunities that you can't really take full advantage of for online participants. Still useful, but if you have the advantage, the luxury of turning up in person because you live in Melbourne, I strongly advise people to take that option.
That's absolutely wonderful, Professor. And we'll make sure we have the links, of course, for people can be involved. Now, being a 6-session series, can people opt in and opt out, or is it recommended that people go to the sequential?
Yes, strongly recommended that people do the whole series. Treat it a little bit as if it were a course, because it's only that will give you a holistic view of the issues we're dealing with. But if you just can't, but you can only come to 3 of the 6 sessions, we don't prevent it. So the registration makes it possible to go for individuals. But the strong recommendation is please do it for all 6 and try and put your house in order so that you can attend all 6, at least online, and ideally, if you're in Melbourne, do it there. I should add one little thing. We're very keen to get young people to come, and young meaning anything from 18 or younger to 30, and we're offering bursaries. That is to say, they're valued at about $400, complimentary attendance in person if you're living in Melbourne, no registration fee, and then 2 other events to happen at a later time, and even a $100 encouragement little grant to spur you on to more hopefully constructive and engaging conversations. So that's all available, the information online, and we encourage applications, and we have a week from today for people to lodge an application, and we hope to make at least 10 or even a dozen available. We'll see how many applications we get.
That's wonderful, because as an advocate, as a past teacher, we really want to get our young people involved. And this is like almost, for me, it's like a once in a lifetime opportunity where you get to hear the voices of people who have really thought deeply and coming from the heart. And I think that's very rare. Do you get something that having someone in place, in person, as you said, not just in a two-dimensional book where you're actually hearing the ideas. And I think that's the thing that you mentioned to me, that I love the synergy of the room, when ideas can kind of almost organically
Yes,
erupt, and
yes.
it's to
Get a life of their
co-relate
own.
the life of their own, and the blood of the room and the veins
Yes.
and traveling really gets me heightened.
That's what we're hoping for.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And just your final thoughts, Professor, because I know this means so much to you. What are your final thoughts about this whole incredible 6-session series?
Well, it's really meant to be a little bit, can't make huge claims, a little bit of the equipment we need to respond um, as concerned, thoughtful, informed citizens, meaning that we want to exercise some responsibility for what happens in our communities, in our homes, in our professional networks, in the country, and for that matter, in the world. And this is a tall order. It's like saying to someone, "I'd like you to come with me, and we're going to climb Mount Everest." Well, that's very nice, but you need a lot of equipping, a lot of training, and a lot of resources. And this series hopes to provide a bit of an equipment that is needed for what's going to be a very demanding, very challenging, but also a very exciting and stimulating journey.
Mm. I can't wait. I'm very excited. So thank you so much for spending some time with us at the Australian Sociological Association, Sociology of Media and Teaching series.
Thank you so much for having me, and look forward to continuing the conversation.